Welcome to the show that puts you at the centre of the national conversation, talking about the issues that matter to you the most. Tonight, everyone is going to pay more tax. As election slogans go, it's not obviously a winner. But that's the warning from Jeremy Hunt ahead of the autumn statement on Thursday. The Chancellor also said he'd make eye-wateringly difficult spending decisions to stop Britain from going bust. It may be sound economics, but what effect will his decisions have on you? I'm Trevor Phillips, and this is The Great Debate. Each week, we get to the heart of the issue dominating the headlines. This week, Jeremy Hunt will lay out his master plan for the economy. It'll be tough. Don't expect him to pull any rabbits out of any hats, though. He's already told us that everyone will have to make sacrifices, but many people are already struggling. Unions are preparing for strikes across the public sector. Is a return to austerity unavoidable? As ever, our viewers panel from around the country and around the world will have their say, they'll tell their stories. And here in the studio, joining us are the General Secretary of the University and College Union, Joe Grady, housing campaigner, Kwejo Twenoboa, the consumer editor of the Financial Times, Claire Barrett, and economist, Vicky Price. The big question tonight: who should bear the brunt of the autumn budget?
British people know that we're right. They know that when you've maxed out on one credit card, it's not the right thing to rush off and get another one.
Austerity is indeed ending.
We will not be responding to this crisis with what people call austerity.
We need a new approach for a new era.
Families have to make sure that in the end they don't just max out on their credit card without having any way of repaying those debts. It's just the same for countries. We're all going to be paying a bit more tax, I'm afraid.
12 years, and what have we got? Low growth, low productivity, and a cost of living crisis.
It is a historic moment. One of the worst economic forecasts this place has ever produced.
If inflation gets out of control, that's not going to help anyone. If interest rates keep spiralling, that's not going to help anyone.
Food banks are at breaking point as 1.3 million emergency parcels are given out in just 6 months.
The Chancellor is understood to be targeting tax rises and spending cuts worth between 50 and 60 billion pounds.
If this plan survived to the other side of an election, I'm a banana.
OK, let's begin, as we always do, with our viewers' panel, with the wall, and talk to Andy Whitehouse in Derbyshire, in the village of Etwall, I think you are, Andy.
It is, Trevor. Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening. Who do you think is going to take the pain here?
Well, if I could just tell you a little bit of history, if I may. Back in 1997, an MP called Edwina Curry popped into our back garden and asked if we were going to vote Conservative. We said no, and she asked why not. And my late wife then said, we're two working people with 2 cars, with 2 jobs, a brand new mortgage with a middle income, and we also pay all our taxes. You look after the rich, you look after the pensioners, and you look after those on benefits. What are you going to do for us? Her answer was this: there is a hole for those in the middle, and we need to do something about it. After that, she left. Now, moving fast forward to today, nothing much has changed. So, my question to the panel is this: should the Chancellor carry on penalising the working man and woman, or should he look at those who can afford to pay and those who shouldn't be mollycoddled.
So, Andy, your point is really about just about managing, as Theresa May would have called you, rather than the very poor or the very rich. OK, let's go to another member of our viewers' panel and talk to Andy Huff.
Good evening.
Good evening, Andrew. You're in there, I think.
Right. Mine is not probably a popular thing, but I think one of the ways to do this is that everyone in this country should be means tested, as this is already done indirectly by the HMRC, but not effectively working against the rich.
OK. So that's a way of focusing the resources on those who need it. OK, thank you very much, Andrew. Your question for our panel is, should more people be means tested? Claire Barrett. Everybody says they want to help the most vulnerable. Is that the way to do it?
Well, the problem with means testing is, do we have the data needed to do it? And we've seen time and time again, with all of the help schemes that were rolled out in the pandemic, things were made at great speed to try and assess who was in need of the greatest assistance. And there were consistently large groups of people who were excluded from the support that was needed. It's very, very hard to design systems that really reward those who need the money the most. And we're seeing that again at the moment with all of the various energy help support schemes that the government has put in place. None of them are perfect. The warm home discount, which is the one that they tried to reform last year, that's now making payments at the moment, the boundary lines for that have changed, and charities are up in arms because people who receive disability living allowance and personal independence payments are now excluded from that help, whereas disabled people face some of the highest costs to heat their homes and run life-saving equipment. So it's very easy to say we can just means test everyone and it will all be fine. In practice, it's very difficult. The other thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on, is where does that leave the state pension? Because, of course, the state pension is a universal benefit. It's paid to everybody, whether they're on the breadline, whether they're a millionaire.
Well, we're going to come to that.
I think that will be coming, the means testing. I'm not relying on getting it.
We're going to come to that a bit later. Vicky Price, you once had the responsibility for advising government on economic policy. What do you think about this issue, about how you focus resources? Because universal benefits of one kind or another are enormously expensive.
Well, that's absolutely true, and we saw that happening during the COVID period when, of course, universal credit was increased. But we did see that it did make a difference for people. And what we saw also when it was finally withdrawn, this extra £20 a week benefit that was given, that there was a huge outcry. So it was, I think, going to the people who needed it most. And it was very widely used, and it did make a big difference. But of course, what we're talking about now is cuts in spending. So we're not talking about, let's just give loads of extra money to people who actually need it. In fact, of course, there is already a process through which this is happening, but the question now for Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak is, where can they find some cuts? And the worries that everybody has been having is, are benefits going to be increasing in line with inflation, which of course they should? And of course, pensions were mentioned. The triple lock is probably going to be maintained for this year, because I'm suspecting that quite a lot of pensioners, or the ones that the Conservatives are thinking about, vote Tory.
I want to come back to the issue of pensions in a moment, but I think we're still tackling this question of somebody is going to have to take some pain here. In fact, from Jeremy Hunt, he says everybody's going to have to take some pain. And the question is, who takes the most? Joe Grady, how do you make the distinction between who needs to be protected and who doesn't?
Well, I think just on the question of the means test, before I get to that, because my answer to that will be no. Means testing is dehumanising, right? And we know for decades why various governments have tried to remove means testing. What I would say in answer to your question is, flip this conversation. Why are we focusing on some of the most vulnerable people in society and asking how we can make their lives that little bit more uncomfortable? You know, and in the UK, If we look at the minute at nurses or at our members in higher education and further education, people who are working really important jobs for society, helping people improve their lives through education, and when they get paid at the end of the month, they might spend 2 days with money in their bank account before they go into their overdraft again. So there are people who are in financial dire straits who are doing everything that is asked of them as citizens. And I'll just end on this. Why aren't we asking, should we be taxing CEOs more? Why aren't we asking why shareholders get so much profit? That's the real question we need to be debating.
Quajo, do you agree with that? Our audience is, I think, responding very positively to that point of view.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we've seen over the last few months, it's those that are worst off that have been impacted the most, and their lives, they're the ones that are taking on the most burden, I think, as it is. I think, and I would support a wealth tax. It was said only last year that a 1% tax on households with over £1 million could generate, I think it was £260 billion that could be reinvested back into our public sector, for example, and that could help run our NHS for a year minimum.
OK. All right, well, look, we're going to come back to this question of who really is wealthy in a moment, but I want to talk to Scott Stripp in Devon, who I think has a slightly different point of view on this question of where the money should come from. Scott, good evening. What's your view about this issue?
Well, listen, we're all finding it hard at the minute, but I do think people can help themselves a little bit more. We've all had to cut out some subscriptions, you know, whether that's Netflix, Disney Plus, I've cancelled Experian, Ancestry, that kind of thing. So I do think there's a little bit more people can be doing at home to help themselves, as opposed to just pointing the finger at wanting more help.
So, Scott, I'm hoping you're not recommending that anybody stops their Sky subscription, but how do you respond to what Joe has said, that this is, in a way, the wrong way round, that what we should be really thinking about are the people who are more affluent already?
Well, I think you need to look more at how much is given already, how much more you want to give. I mean, I think people forget that we're coming out of COVID and billions were spent to keep people at home and to keep a roof over their head. But, I mean, how much money does the government have? I mean, Jeremy Hunt has said that we're running out of money, we haven't got enough, and we all need to pay more. So, you know, where's the money going to come from?
OK, thank you. Joe Grady, I mean, there is an issue here. I mean, it's relatively easy to say, let's tax the high earners, but we know that actually that raises relatively small sums. And whether you think that Jeremy Hunt has to find 30 billion or 60 billion, taxing people who earn more than, let's say, 150,000, a bit more, isn't going to fill that hole.
I think we need to take a step back, right? We've just heard of VT at the beginning of this about the nation's credit card. This government set the economy on fire with a mini budget, and I doubt if we're talking in this language, we'd get a loan from Wonga now, right, as the UK. And yet we're being asked by these people to accept that, you know, a college lecturer who earns £25,000 a year just needs to cancel a Netflix subscription. It is absurd. There has to be a bigger structural change. And for working people, they can see that for decades, their wages have been shrinking. My members get paid 25% less now than they did in 2009. The answer is not more of the medicine that they've been giving us for 3 decades. OK. Andrew Huff, you asked this question about means testing. It's not a very popular solution down here, and indeed across the panel. What is your response to what Joe Grady's just said?
I agree with them that basically, at the end of the day, it should be the richer people paying for it. If you just look at our past prime ministers, Johnson is worth 1.6 million net, Hunt is 1.8 million net, Sunak is 750 million net. So basically, turkeys will not vote for Christmas.
OK.
And these are the people who can afford it.
OK. OK, Vicky, are we being a bit unrealistic here about this, the possibility of raising the vast sums? Even if there are cuts, which we'll come to a little later, there's still going to be, the story is, at the moment, 20 billion or thereabout that needs to come out of tax. That's going to have to come from a lot of people rather than a few rich people, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And of course, I don't think they will be able to raise income tax, but there is such amount of money that can be raised and is being raised and has been raised for some time now, but just keeping the allowances, the tax allowances, frozen. So what's going on right now is because of high inflation, yes, wages are not keeping up with inflation, but they're still rising and rising much more than they have done for a very long period of time on an annual basis. You collect a lot more tax if you just leave the allowances where they are. Loads more people are now entering, for the first time, paying tax, which they didn't do before, and many more millions are beginning to pay and will increasingly do so because those allowances may well be frozen for the next 4 years, possibly even longer. The millions will start paying the higher rate of income tax. So there is a way of making everyone pay through the back door, and this isn't really discussed enough, and people don't quite realise that that's what's going on.
Well, we are actually going to be talking about how the pain can be spread more, or will need to be spread a bit more widely in a moment. You're watching The Great Debate. Up next, is it fair to protect pensioners' incomes at the expense of working people who are struggling right now?
Pensions will be going up by 10%, linked to inflation. Do nurses have broader shoulders than wealthy retirees spending time on the golf course?
It was in our manifesto to keep the triple lock. Rishi was also very clear that he's a Prime Minister that's standing on that 2019 manifesto.
When winter comes, I can't tell you how I'm going to do it, but I'll have to.
Is the time for debate. Time for discussions. Time for answers.
The evidence is there.
Time to join the conversation.
I really hated it.
To try and make sense of issues that affect you.
9 p.m.
9 p.m.
9 p.m.
Is the soundtrack to your weeknights on Sky News.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent. We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
Welcome back to the great debate where we're asking who should bear the brunt of the autumn budget. Now, wherever the axe falls this week, it seems likely that the pension triple lock will be protected. Older people are important to any government. More of them tend to vote, more of us tend to vote, but there are questions over how long the state can go on spending more on the affluent old when many younger working people are still struggling to get on the housing ladder and to make ends meet. Let me see what the sentiment on our wall is at the beginning of this part. Might come back to you at the end of the part. Question for our viewers panel is this. Is it time for the government to drop their commitment to the triple lock? Let's see who thinks that Jeremy Hunt should say, we have regrettably had to decide that we can't commit to the triple lock. And let me remind you, a 10% increase in pensions for people like Phillips. Well, thank you all very much. Virtually our whole viewers panel think that I should get a 10% uplift in my state pension. Vicky, does that seem just to you?
Well, of course, we have to bear in mind that the state pension isn't that great. So by comparison to what people get in other countries, it's pretty low in relation to average earnings. So you get less pension than people who are just beginning to work and have an allowance of £12,500 or £12,570. So the pension that you get is less than that. So for the average person. And most people don't have an occupational pension scheme. So we're talking about the year as a whole. So, of course, there are people with occupational pension schemes who get a lot more, but the average pensioner is by no means particularly rich. And if you look at all the extra costs that they now have to bear, whether it's food, whether it's keeping themselves warm, whether it is even, you know, going around and looking after their grandchildren, for example, which many of them do, what you want is you want an active older population that goes out and spends money and keeps the economy going.
All right, Vicky. Let's talk to somebody who is objectively maybe on the other side of this. He may agree with you. We'll see. I'm going to talk to Alex Hicks, who is a young person. Alex, you're, by my lights, you're a very young person. What do you think about this point?
So I'm 21 years old. I've just graduated university. I've got £50,000 worth of debt and living in a shared flat in London. And essentially, me and my friends are faced with the prospect of, you know, not being able to get on the property ladder, you know, because of crazy property prices and high mortgage rates. And the economic prospects for my generation in the medium term also look uncertain at best. So it's becoming clear that the likelihood that I'll ever own a home is slim. So my question is I understand that we're going through difficult times, but why should pensioners be given special treatment with my generation footing the bill? You know, especially given the state of public services, you know, nurses are looking at far less than a 10% pay rise.
Okay.
So, yeah.
OK. Alex, I think you may be in the minority amongst our audience, but it's a good question for our panel. Is it fair to prioritise protecting pensions? Quajo, you and Alex, between you, are still... If you added up your ages, you're still younger than the pension age.
Yes.
What do you think of what he said?
Do you know what? I hear Alex and I hear his concerns, especially about student loans and the cost that young people have, especially coming out of a university, and it is a conversation that needs to happen. But in regards to pensions, I think, obviously, we know the triple lock was introduced in 2010. It was a manifesto promise in 2019, and I think it's something that needs to be kept and fulfilled by the government. Having said that, it's not an excuse for the government not to look after those that are worst off within British society, those doing the worst. I think they need to find a solution to keep the triple lock, but also make sure they're looking after those that are worst off.
Claire, what is the solution, if there is one?
Well, the mathematical solution is that the triple lock, I'm afraid, is doomed because of the demographics within our population. If we're going to keep paying out an inflation-linked benefit to the growing number of pensioners in our society, as Vicky said, some of whom are relying solely on that money, the majority, but others who have got pension wealth, others who maybe are still working, then you've got to increase the number of people who are paying tax in the workforce to sustain that population. Now, a big debate that's going on at the moment is the falling birth rate in Britain. How do we increase our population to support this elderly demographic? Do we encourage people to have children? Well, the cost of childcare is yet another thing that is really, really holding back the lives of young people in their 30s and beyond who are trying to start a family. Or do we allow more immigration to come in, which is obviously another really hot issue, especially for the Conservative Party after Brexit? So, very difficult question.
I want to follow up this point that both you and Vicky have made, essentially about the poor pensioners. I think in the next period, the number of over 85s is going to double, and a lot of those will be poor. Let's talk to Eddie Baines, who is indeed a pensioner, and I think, Eddie, you're in Lancashire, is that right? If Eddie can hear me, can you hear me, Eddie?
I can hear you now, yes, thank you.
Great. I was just saying that we've been having a discussion here about pensioner poverty. Talk to us about your situation.
My only income is the state pension. I have a very small pension pot that isn't going to last forever. It's my view that those in work, as I did, need to pay more tax, especially the very wealthy. And is it fair and reasonable that the government not carry out their election manifesto promise on the triple lock, not once, but maybe twice?
OK, so Eddie, you're for the maintenance of the triple lock as it is. Let's talk to another pensioner, Andrew Snowden, who I think may not be quite so sure. Andrew, what's your view about this?
Well, I think we're being given false... there is really no shortage of cash. It's how it's distributed. It's like being told, should I shoot my wife or my daughter? You just don't shoot either. Of those of £1 million plus, they pay 11% tax. They pay under 30% tax, and some of them pay less than 11% tax. A wealth tax of 1% would produce 260 billion, according to an LSE report a year or two ago. So it is about redistribution, and you shouldn't be then attacking people who are really at or below the poverty line. As Vicky has said, we already have one of the lowest safety nets. And pensioners, of course, will get taxed if they have other income, if they're above 12,000. So many people are taxed who have secondary incomes. So this is a threshold that people have worked all their life for. I'm wealthy, I have low income. The threshold should be set for everybody, and that includes pensioners.
OK, Andrew, thank you for that. Joe, is there some part of you that says, well, actually, there are well-off pensioners who really don't need this uplift, and if we didn't give it to them, then we could support those who really do?
The hallmark of a good society is not how we treat our most wealthy, it's how we treat our most vulnerable. And the question at hand now...
But my point is, this would help you...
But without creating an
vulnerable.
incredibly complex situation, we are debating whether or not pensioners, all of whom have worked all their lives, paid taxes, should get what has been promised to them rather than have to forfeit it because the government have botched up the economy. So I don't think we should get into, should we do this for them? The lock should stay, but I'll also say, it shouldn't be, do we punish young people starting out in life who are already saddled with debt, or do we punish old people? We're the 6th richest economy in the world.
All right, let's see if there has been any point to this discussion at all by going back to our viewers panel and asking you, same question I asked you at the beginning of this part. In fact, let me ask it this way. Does any of you think that Mr. Hunt should stand up on Thursday and say, regrettably, we have decided that we cannot sustain the triple lock? Anybody been convinced that that should be a thing worth doing? OK, I can see 1, 2, maybe 3, 4, 5. Well, OK, well, I suspect Mr Hunt's not going to do that, and he certainly won't be doing it if this is representative of the electorate. Thank you very much. You are watching The Great Debate. Still to come, what's the fairest way to prioritise our public services? And who's really running the country? The government or the markets?
Ambulance response times across all categories are the worst on record.
Our midwives and our maternity support workers are facing real financial hardship, and no one is listening.
Nurses have voted to take strike action.
5 potential strikes already. A real nightmare for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister.
Welcome back to The Great Debate, where we're asking who should bear the brunt of the autumn budget. One of Jeremy Hunt's main tasks following the chaos that followed Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget is setting out a credible plan for government spending and taxation, one that will keep the financial markets happy. And it's prompted some to ask, do the markets now run the country? Here's our economics and data editor, Ed Conway.
Britain may only now be entering recession, but the economic crisis has already claimed some victims. Rusty was on the brink of buying a property at the very moment interest rates spiked after the mini-budget. In 3 days, his mortgage offer went up by £400 a month, £5,000 a year.
It was a massive change and a shock at first, and I'll be honest, I had to decide, do I want to change my standard of living? What do I want to give up for this property? It could be £1,500 tomorrow, right? So it was a bit of a risk.
It is a reminder that the events of recent months were not just numbers on a screen, they had real consequences. But as the new Chancellor puts the finishing touches to the autumn statement this week, questions still remain about what really happened. Was the government really all to blame? Some are asking, wasn't someone else responsible here? What about the Bank of England? Weren't they too slow to raise interest rates? Wasn't the fatal moment for Liz Truss when Andrew Bailey withdrew his support for the bond market? If so, that would make this the key intervention.
You've got 3 days left now. You've got to get this done.
When he appeared at an event in Washington and imposed that deadline. 3 days later, the Chancellor was gone, shortly followed by the PM, leading some to argue that the governor really sealed her fate.
Still standing.
In an interview with Sky News, he dismissed that speculation.
I vehemently disagree with this because it is based on a fallacy. Had we gone on with that intervention beyond the point of financial stability being suitably restored, we'd have been creating another problem, which is what economists tend to call a moral hazard problem, i.e., people would say, well, the Bank of England is always going to intervene, and that's wrong. We did the job we set out to do.
You didn't depose Liz Truss?
No, of course we didn't depose Liz Truss. I would never do anything like that.
And most protagonists argue that the former PM made her own mistakes, including one economist who said he warned her.
We said markets are in a very febrile state. If your policy actions are not clear and not understood, there will be a market crisis.
So you warned very explicitly about this risk.
I said this publicly and privately.
And with the era of cheap money coming to an end, others fear that this British crisis might be a sign of further crises to come. The eventual story might feel very different to the one we're hearing today. Ed Conway, Sky News.
Ed Conway, right. Let's go to Ewan Carmichael in Kilmarnock on this issue of spending, services, cuts and all of that. Ewan, what's your thought?
Hi. Yeah, I think it's really important that, things like spending cuts and austerity are really dangerous. No government department should really have to cut corners or lay off staff to save money. And departments such as education, it's really a struggle for particularly for education staff. Also defence and our support against Ukraine, and obviously health as well with the ongoing crises that we're facing. So we should absolutely not return to austerity. Not only is it a very poor idea and it can cost money and lives, but also because it will leave a financial burden for young people like myself to pick up in many decades to come as well.
Ewan, thank you very much indeed. Stick there for a second. Joe Grady, Ewan's, the sort of person that your members are teaching. Mm-hmm. And his point that we shouldn't go back to austerity, everybody would want to be in that situation, but do we actually have an option now?
Yes, it's a very simple answer. And I'll go back to something I said, earlier in the show. When we are told by people there is no option other than austerity, we need to look at who those people are, because they're usually the people who've been saying there's no option to austerity for several years now, if not a decade or longer. And those people are saying we need more of this to get through this. And all we see is wages continuing to get lower, at the minute inflation getting higher, more children getting hungry, more pensioners not cooking hot meals. More of this is not the solution, and I couldn't be clearer about that.
OK, so what is?
I think that there's so many more progressive taxation mechanisms that have already been discussed on this show. I would also like to draw attention to, much of the money that we saw going on what seemed to be dodgy contracts during the pandemic, nice tax cuts for friends. Lord knows what happened to a lot of money during the bonfire of the mini budget. I want to put a lens on where that money is going and the type of money we could raise through proper taxation.
Vicky, there's slack in the system. There are people who are sort of apparently swilling with cash, and that we could get it off them.
Well, I think there are some intentions to do precisely that. And the first thing that happened, of course, when the mini-budget proved to be such a disaster, is that the top rate of income tax that had been slashed or thrown out of the window, really, the 45p, was reinstated. So that was the first sign that the whole tone of the mini-budget was wrong, because it was immediately labelled as the budget or the mini-budget for the rich. So that at least is gone. And there are now discussions of even reducing the threshold from where you start paying that higher rate of income tax. So I think there's been a complete reversal of thinking in that area. And there is more that can come. Capital gains tax can be looked at again, and I think there are some ideas too there about what to do with the threshold. So dividend tax increases are quite likely to happen as well. So there are all sorts of leaks that suggest that it is widening, the sort of tax area that they're going to be looking at is widening. But nevertheless, you still don't raise huge amount out of those areas.
I want to come to one particular tax, inheritance tax, a little later. But Claire Barrett, you deal with people spending, individual, consumer, retail spending and so on. This is going to mean something significant for the average person, the just about managing person that we spoke to right at the top of the show. Are we sort of missing the point here that actually the bulk of this, of what needs to happen now, is going to affect that great middle swathe of households?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the acceleration in mortgage interest rates, which we were just hearing about there from Rusty, that happened after the mini-budget, has really pushed the cost of living crisis up the income scale. You've got people whose happiness basically depends on at what point their fixed rate mortgage comes to an end. You could have colleagues in an office who have identical jobs, identical salaries, and by luck one of them has done a 5-year fix and the other did a 2-year, and all of a sudden their monthly costs are going to increase by hundreds and hundreds of pounds. It is a real disaster that this has happened so quickly. We knew that the economy was turning around, that interest rates were rising up again. It's not taking as quickly as we would like for them to stabilise, although the Bank of England thinks that interest rates are not going to be as high as the financial markets are predicting. So there's a bit of a standoff there. The markets
thought they'd be over 6%. The Bank of England's now saying, what, 4.5%, that sort of thing?
Well, lower than that in the long term. But I think the thing that is slightly missing from this debate is while we're so aware of what the cost of living crisis means for our own personal finances, we're not as aware of how bad things have got for the government's own finances. And for me, on Thursday, seeing what the Office for Budget Responsibility is actually saying when it comes to the numbers on debt. Now, that was what was missing at the mini-budget.
From Kwasi Kwarteng's
We didn't have the numbers. We're going to get them this time, and they're going to be really horrible, and that's why we're being warmed up for big tax.
OK, let's go back, because I want to talk to Martin Travis, who I could see very animated in the earlier part of our discussion about pensions. And I think, Martin, you've got a point to make about this whole issue of how we square the circle. Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, Trevor. I really don't think that we should be prioritising the triple lock. It's not where the conversation needs to be at. We've just seen rail strikes go under. We're up to the NHS all walk out, and this really is not where the conversation should be. We should be concentrating on the nurses and the workers to actually look after them, really. And the triple lock really should be parked as a priority for this government, really.
OK. Joe Grady, I mean, he's making a point here, because you're telling me that your members need help, they need a pay rise and so on, and they're in big trouble. And he's making the point there's a way to deal with that in reality. Why are you so resistant to making that sum add up?
Well, I'm not. I mean, if you look at our members, because, you know, you've raised it. So in the UK at the minute, we're about to launch on nationwide strike action in universities. If we look at what's happening in universities, the people that run universities earn 44.5 million amongst them.
We're talking about the top people, the vice-chancellors,
Yeah,
right?
the vice-chancellors, but the sector has £40 billion of reserves, and the people who work in it have had a 25% pay cut. Students have had fees trebled along with everything else.
Okay.
There is money to pay people properly. People are voting to take strike action, not because they think pensioners are getting it, because they're saying enough is enough and the money is there.
All right. Let's go to a break. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, says he will be fair and compassionate. But morale in many workplaces is at rock bottom. If we want growth, how important is happiness in the workforce?
There are two reasons why Candy isn't working: her left knee and her right knee. She wants to get back to work in nursing, but she's temporarily on universal credit.
Levels of economic inactivity among the long-term sick have risen by more than 500,000 since the pandemic.
More and more people are finding themselves in vulnerable positions, whether it's personally or the impact that the economic climate is having on their businesses.
I discovered that there's quite a big backstory to the creation of the SAS, particularly a character called Dudley Clark. And so when I researched the book, I took it right back to the beginning of the war, and this guy basically invented modern special forces, what we know as the SAS commandos. He invented the US Rangers. He inspired the creation of OSS, which became the CIA, and I knew none of that, even though I'd served in the military. Clark was a 40-year-old staff officer at the beginning of the war, and he hated the idea of the Second World War. He was dismayed by it because he'd lost a lot of friends in the First World War, and he thought that the way to win the Second World War would be something called subliminal methods. So he thought by special forces, little pinprick raids behind the lines, and deception of the enemy, we could defeat the much bigger German army. And he started doing that well before the narrative we know, which is Sir David Stirling came along in 1941. He was actually up and running before he got commissioned to create the SAS. The big successes he had was creating modern special forces, which started with the commandos, which then developed into the LRDG, which is the Long Range Desert Group, which is a unit that operated in the desert, which then led to the creation of the SAS, basically. And in all of that, he did things like he deceived Rommel. I mean, there was a famous attack in North Africa where Rommel was on holiday with his wife in Italy when the British attacked for his birthday in a hotel, and he did that. Sicily, he diverted forces away from Sicily. Italy, at the Anzio beachhead, British forces waded ashore unopposed because the Germans were further north, thinking we were going to attack there. And then in 1944, he diverted all of the Mediterranean forces down to the south by creating a fake army that the Germans thought was going to attack up through Croatia and Greece. We went straight from the Second World War into the Cold War, so we wanted to use these skills against the Russians. And so snippets of the stories have come out. You'll have heard of things like Operation Mincemeat, which is part of a bigger deception he did. There was I Was Monty's double, so he came up with that idea of getting an actor to play Monty and wander around the Mediterranean. So little pieces came out, but the overall picture, the overall story was kept under wraps. And actually, the last of his missions was only declassified in 2000, so quite recently.
Welcome back to the great debate where we're asking who should bear the brunt of the autumn budget. Now, since the COVID pandemic, the workforce has changed. Many people have left their jobs altogether. Others are choosing the path of quiet quitting. That's the idea of doing the bare minimum to avoid getting sacked. But the UK's growth and productivity is still sluggish. Inflation is at a 40-year high, with the threat of a long recession looming. So, against this gloomy backdrop, what can we do to lift the mood in the workplace right now? Jackie Mahoney. Jackie, I think you've got a question for our panel on this point.
Yeah, I mean, I work in social care, so I'm part of the social care workforce. I'm a social worker. I think there are lots of things that could be created within the workforce environment. Particularly, pay is a particular issue, and being recognised in terms of the level of pay, and certainly within the social care workforce, then that is something that is a real issue in terms of recruitment and retention. Being recognised in terms of qualification, in terms of training and investment, and having good working environment. So
your question for our panel is, Jackie?
How can we create a happier workforce?
OK, well, let's get optimistic. Thank you, Jackie. Your question is, how do we create a happy workforce? Now, Kwejo, the nation is waiting.
Yeah.
You have the answer.
And I think it is the basic answer that I think everyone's been fighting for, and that's to pay our public sector workers what it is they deserve. I mean, we've heard last week that nurses are going to go out on strike, and we remember what the NHS gave to us during the pandemic. They were breaking their backs to save lives, and we were out banging pots in celebration. But at the end of the day, that wasn't paying their bills. That wasn't feeding their kids. What they want is to be able to pay their bills, feed their kids at the end of the month, and live a decent, have a decent standard of living. Unfortunately, they're not getting that. And we saw last week an article where a nurse is having to eat the leftovers of their patients, or you look at education, for example, and teachers and staff are having to open food banks, not just for the students, not just for the parents, but the staff there. And we're seeing the same in the NHS. We need to prioritise them. They are the backbone to this country, and that's where the foundation starts, I think.
All right, well, hold on for that second. I think we've got a student teacher. Are you Dan Aitken? I think we've got a student teacher who I think might respond to exactly to that point. Dan, what's your feeling? You're going to be a teacher, is that right?
Yeah. I'm going into teaching. I'm starting next year, and right now I have little to no incentive to actually pursue a career because it's clear that I'm not going to have the money to survive after a couple of years. There's the pay progression levels out very, very quickly, and the support for students, the student teachers, and for myself is going to be abysmal. And if there's not enough funding in, I don't see how school's going to stay open. It's
Dan,
being on the side is bad.
Dan, you're painting a pretty miserable prospectus there. Why are you doing it? What's the
because I
point?
want to. I've wanted to for years. It's something that I've always had a passion for. But it helps that I have the emotional reward of it, but that doesn't pay my bills.
OK. Claire Barrett, you study workplaces, you write about them. What do people need, aside from money?
They need for their vocations not to be exploited, Trevor, which is what, sadly, we are seeing in the teaching profession. I come from a family of teachers. The nursing profession, some members of my family are nurses, one is a retired nurse. And also, as Jackie said at the beginning of the segment, the caring profession. Now, time and time again, even people who work with nurseries, work with little children, there are huge problems with the nursery funding at the moment. Care is just not something we value. In a society. It's something that women have traditionally done for free. That is probably the reason why. And we really need to see the value of it as society changes and ages.
Joe, very quickly, not specifically about your members, but what could Jeremy Hunt do that would maybe make the tough period coming more palatable for people in workplaces?
I think one of the biggest problems for people in workplaces that saps their morale, that makes them not enjoy being there, is overwork. If the government could introduce trialling a 4-day working week, that would be great. That could make people a lot happier.
That's going to
Not the answer you wanted.
cut our productivity by 20%.
But he's serious. Overwork, you know, is really what pushes people out. It's what the teacher was just saying.
Vicky, you think that's worth trying?
Well, of course, if you get paid full-time but working for 4 days a week, then that's pretty good. But in reality, flexibility has proved to improve productivity rather than reduce it.
All right, look, we could talk about this all night, but that, in fact, is all we have time for this evening. And it remains for me to say thank you to our panellists here in the studio. Vicky Price, Claire Barrett, Kwejo Twinabella and Joe Grady. Of course, as always, it's you at home who are at the centre of our conversation, and if you'd like to be part of the programme, next time, get in touch. Email us at thegreatdebate@sky.uk. And, of course, I want to say thank you to our viewers panel, always contribution, lifting our debate. And thank you at home for joining us. You keep talking, and we'll see you again at the same time next week for The Great Debate.